Hi, I'm Anay Mehrotra. I'll be talking about a paper on selection in the presence of intersectional implicit bias. This is joint work with Bary Pradelski at CNRS and my advisor Nisheeth Vishnoi at Yale University. Selection decisions arise in many real-world social contexts, including hiring, promotions, and university admissions. In all of these contexts, the main job of the decision maker is to estimate a latent utility Wi for each applicant I. In hiring, the latent utility captures the value that the applicant will bring to the firm, and in university admissions, it captures some measure of the student success in the program. If there are n positions, then given these utilities, the decision maker selects the top n applicants. This entire process relies on the assumption that the decision maker can accurately observe these latent utilities. However, the utilities observed by the decision maker can be skewed due to their implicit bias. A decision maker is not consciously aware of their implicit biases, and so even if they are trying to genuinely select the best applicants, they can underestimate the latent utilities of applicants in certain affected groups. The adverse effects of implicit bias are well documented in a variety of social contexts, from hiring to promotions to peer reviews. And significant research also documents that applicants that are at the intersection of multiple affected groups face a higher implicit bias. For instance, in peer reviews of fellowship applications, Penaras and Gold found that among applicants with a similar research quality, women who were also unaffiliated with the evaluation committee received much lower scores than women who were affiliated with the evaluation committee and men who were affiliated or unaffiliated with the committee. We consider a model of implicit bias introduced by Klambeek and Raghavan and later extended by others. Here, there are multiple affected groups that can possibly overlap with each other. Candidates in affected groups face implicit bias. Their observed utilities are smaller than the relating utilities. And candidates who are in multiple groups face a higher bias, which is equal to the compounded effect of the bias of all groups they belong to. Apart from affecting the candidates, the implicit bias also reduces the latent utility of the selection. And because of this, the decision maker can end up hiring less valuable candidates than they could have. As a policymaker, the question for me is, what interventions or measures can I take to reduce these adverse effects? Many interventions have been proposed to mitigate the adverse effects of implicit bias. Here we'll focus on representation constraints and examine their efficacy. Representation constraints typically require the decision maker to select at least L1 applicants from group 1, at least L2 applicants from group 2, and so on, where the policymaker chooses the values L1, L2, and etc. These constraints are non-intersectional. They place lower bounds group by group, but do not specify lower bounds on the intersections. However, applicants at the intersections face a higher implicit bias. So if I'm a policymaker, I need to know whether non-intersectional constraints are sufficient to mitigate the adverse effects of implicit bias, or do we need to use intersectional lower bound constraints? For instance, with two groups, intersectional constraints will require the selection to have at least L1 applicants who are in just group 1, at least L2 applicants who are in just group 2, and at least L3 applicants who are in both groups 1 and group 2. Prior work study the setting where there's a single affected group and assume that the latent utilities of applicants are drawn IID from some distribution. The latter captures the belief that the set of applicants in each group have the same distribution of latent utilities. They show that representation constraints can improve the expected latent utility of the selection. And in fact, there are constraints such that irrespective of the bias of the decision maker, if a decision maker is required to satisfy these constraints, then the subset that the output has near optimal utility. However, these results assume that there is just one affected group and all applicants in this group face the same bias, neither of which is true with intersectional groups. We consider multiple and overlapping affected groups and with IID latent utilities. First, we show that no matter which non-intersectional constraint is used, if a decision maker is biased, then they lose a constant fraction of the optimal utility. Next, we show that there are intersectional constraints that, irrespective of the decision maker's bias, ensure that the constrained decision maker achieves near optimal utility. In combination, our two results show that intersectional constraints have advantages over non-intersectional constraints in countering intersectional implicit bias. In the paper, we show that these results are robust to deviations from this model of implicit bias, and I encourage you to check out the paper and the long talk for more details and key ideas in the proof. With that, thanks for your attention, and I'll be happy to take your questions in the Q&A session.